It is a challenge, though, because there's many things that community, like the size and the scale of University Place does. There's many things that tug and pull at our attention and our resources. And so we have committed what we can to public safety at this point. Tonight we're going to explain some potential programs. The chief is going to be starting a presentation in just a moment or two. And there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. And if you're interested in asking questions, it's just raise a hand. And the chief will recognize you. He'll provide answers. I do want to take a moment and ask each of our council members, starting with Caroline Lisi, just to introduce themselves.
Hi, thanks for showing up tonight. It's great to see this turnout for our final meeting. I'm Caroline Belisi. I'm council member for position number 7.
Thank you. Kent?
Hey, good evening, everyone. Ken Keel. I am happy to be here and glad you're all to see all your faces. I am council member for position number 2.
And Ed?
Ed Wood, thank you for coming.
All right. And again, on behalf of the council, thank you all. I want to invite Police Chief Primo to get things underway.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, everyone, for being here. As the Mayor said, this is our third and final public presentation. We're calling them listening sessions, and I want to stress that this is an opportunity for us to have a dialogue about public safety in University Place. I'm going to give you some information, and then you feel free to ask some questions. I have the presentation is like 12 or so slides. The idea is I'll get through all those slides. That way we're kind of respecting people's time so they can get the information. If they want to leave, then they can leave, but then we'll save the questions for after the slides. And typically, just so you know, we have plenty of questions, so there'll be plenty of time to ask any type of questions that you have. As the Mayor talked about, so the council back in January had a goals retreat, and their number one goal from that retreat was public safety. And so at that time, the staff was given the direction to start seeking some public input on public safety. First thing we did is we got a survey from the community. So we hired a research company to conduct a scientific survey with the community about public safety. This wasn't a simple yes/no. It was a 10 to 12 minute long survey with a bunch of questions. It was done telephone, in person, via the internet, to try and really get to what people's concerns were around public safety. Let's go ahead and go to the first slide. Hopefully you all can see that, and those that are online can also see this. So as a part of that survey, this was a question that was asked, and what do you think is the most important problem facing University Place today? This was an open-ended question. This wasn't a multiple choice. This was taking the responses from those 300 people and putting them into categories. And as you can see from the response, crime and drugs was the number one concern from the public. Even that number 2 spot at 10, you could say traffic and congestion is a relation to public safety as well. So now we're pushing that 50% of respondents have a public safety concern in our community. I'm going to give you some time to go through those things, but let's go ahead and go to the second slide. Or the next slide, I should say. So here's where we're talking about what are we facing here in University Place. I like to start this conversation as talking about violent crime. And fortunately, violent crime is not an issue that we face. So a lot of our neighboring jurisdictions, the more urbanized communities, your Tacoma, your Lakewood, even unincorporated Pierce County and the Parkland, Spanaway area, are seeing record numbers in violent crimes. Homicide rates and shootings are really at record numbers. We are not seeing that here in University Place. Fortunately for us, that is not our issue. Our violent crime rate is very low, even for a city of our size of 35,000 residents. What we are challenged with is property crimes. And as you can see here, so this 2022 number this is based on, we took the data of incidents that have already occurred through April and projected it out through the end of 2022 so that you can get a comparison to the previous years. And we're on a record pace for property crimes. And these are incidents like vehicle prowls, thefts, shoplifting, vehicle thefts, those types of incidents. Property crimes impact us in many different ways. So, and there is a challenge to try and address them because property crimes typically happen when a person is not there, right? So it happens at night. It happens when you're inside the store or when you're on that walk at Chambers Bay. It is not So they're very challenging to combat crimes or property crimes. So there's many different ways that you can do that to mitigate those things. There's different crime prevention things, and one of those is just the presence of law enforcement. And then our response and how we investigate those crimes to try and address the property crimes. Let's go to the next slide. So our current staffing. In University Place, we have 16 commissioned staff members for a city of 35,000. What that means is we have 0.45 officers per 1,000. That's a ratio that's used a lot of times to compare police staffing in jurisdictions. Our number of officers per 1,000 is the lowest in the state of Washington. So at 0.45, out of those 218, we're at the lowest. For cities between 20,000 and 40,000, between 20,000 and 60,000, the average is about 1.19 officers per 1,000. So we're lagging a little bit behind in that respect. But what I want to say is that is not the one way to measure the appropriate number of law enforcement officers for a community. Every community is different. I think a great example is the city of Fife here in Pierce County. They have about 11,000 residents in the city of Fife, but they have about 32 officers. That's because during the daytime, that city swells in population due to their huge industrial, commercial activities. So they have a much greater need based on the number of actual residents. So you can't just use that one kind of formula as the measure to say this is how many officers we need, this number of people there are, this is how many officers we should have. It's just one kind of formula that you use to look at how many officers you should have. I think this is another example of looking at your officers, the number of officers you have. So we took the dispatched calls per service and compared that total number of dispatched calls and the number of officers, commissioned officers, staff that you have, and you get this ratio of number of calls per officer. You can see that we average, or the officers here have much more in comparison to our neighboring jurisdictions. We're at 389 per officer, and Tacoma down at 290, Lakewood at 288. And then when you get down to those smaller communities like Steilacoom and Furcrest, it's a much easier, an even much smaller number of calls per officer. That averages at 267 amongst all those agencies. The other component I talk about in terms of officers is not necessarily, I like to use the word police officer availability versus response time. That's one of the components we're trying to get at is right now with our staffing, we have 2 officers on duty at a time. And you look at our calls for service, 70% of the dispatch calls, so not self-initiated, everything that people call 911 for, 70% of those calls are 2-person calls or more. So 70% of the time, both officers are being tied up on the same call, and that means there are no other officers available in the city to respond to another call. And again, that call volume is starting to increase the demand on our services. So that's why we're looking at increasing our staffing in the patrol area to have more availability for when officers are busy on one call, we still have the ability to go to another call when that one is still in progress. Let's go to the next slide. So now we're talking about how do we pay for police in University Place. And as you can see from this graphic here, a lot of people aren't familiar with where their property taxes go. I know I wasn't before I became a chief. I just paid the bill as a part of my home mortgage, and I don't really know where all that money goes. So in the city, 6 cents on each dollar is what the city collects of your property tax. The rest of that money goes to these different entities, the county, the state, the fire department, and the schools. So of that 6 cents that the city collects, they dedicate all of the property tax to public safety. The challenge that we're faced with is the cost of public safety, right? So your property taxes can only, the city collects can only increase at 1% each year, but the costs for public safety continue to rise. Just like all of our budgets and everything are impacted, the costs of things that we do, it's no different for public safety. Those costs start to increase at 3 or 5% each year, and that 1% is not going to keep up with that. The city has a budget that manages those increases, but what it means is we don't have the capacity to add staffing under the current property tax rate. Let's go to the next slide. I can feel people getting questions, so I'm trying not to rush through this, but I know that some of you have heard this multiple times. So again, this is just a little bit of a snapshot of where your property taxes go. As you can see, the city portion being that bottom line, since the incorporation, the start back in 1996, you can see a pretty flat rate for the city's portion that they collect. And again, all of that goes to public safety. The other two, the fire and school, are a huge portion of your property taxes, and those are based on voter-approved levies and bonds. The other component I like to say is, I think this is good information for you to be aware of, because I think a lot of people just assume that all of their property taxes, or at least a lot of it, goes to the city. I like to remind people that schools and fire are an absolute key component to public safety as well. A vibrant, successful school district, school program is important to public safety. Your fire department, our EMS, is also important to public safety. So I just want to throw that out there. This isn't an anti-police or anti-fire, anti-schools campaign of mine. I just think it's important to understand where your tax dollars are going, so people understand what we're doing with that dollars that come into the city, again, dedicated to public safety, but we're limited in comparison. Let's go to the next slide. So under the current proposals that the city is looking at, this levy would cost between $267 and $571 a month for every $100,000 in your assessed home's value. So the average home is assessed at $525, and this would be roughly $14 a month on that low end of the range. So if you see that $168 a year, you take that $408 that the average homeowner is currently paying in 2022, and you can add that $168 to it. So now you're at that $576 number, and it still puts you well below our other partners in your property tax. Let's go to the next slide. So what do we plan on doing with this public safety levy? First is improving our criminal investigations capacity. Under our current staffing model, I told you we had 16 total commissioned staff members. We have 1 investigator. And as I talked about with our rise in property crimes, we don't have the capacity to maintain it. We've got to have more investigative resources, one, to address the rise in property crimes, but we also want to have the capacity to handle even more complex cases right here in University Place. We are a contracted agency, so the city pays the sheriff to have their police department. So I am a member of the sheriff's department. I was selected from the sheriff's department to be your police chief, as are all the officers that are here. They are deputies with the sheriff's department. As a part of that contract, when we have a major crime, whether it's a homicide or a shooting, the Sheriff's Investigative Bureau is the one that comes in and helps us handle that. What we want to do is have more resources here within University Place, because any type of person crime goes to the Sheriff's Criminal Investigations Bureau, and that gets thrown into the pile with all the other cases that they are working. And with their limited resources, they have to prioritize all their cases, and that means UP cases don't always get worked. And that's always kind of a difficult thing to talk to a victim about. The fact that we have to rely on somebody that I don't have any control over, whether or not their case gets worked. So the idea is adding more capacity here within the city. We can control more cases that we can do in-house investigations on. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I already talked about our staffing with 2 officers. The idea is we're going to increase our patrol. The people that are answering the 911 calls, the people in the uniform, the people in the patrol cars that are driving around handling those calls for service. We want to go from 2 officers on a shift at a time to 3 officers that are available. Again, I use that word availability versus response time. We just need to increase our availability. The officers right now, what we want to increase is a thing called discretionary time. So that means during their time, they get a call for service. That time in between the calls is their discretionary time, where they can patrol a neighborhood, they can sit on a side of the street and run some radar, they can go check on Chambers Bay, they can go drive through the school parking lots, they can do those types of things. Under our current staffing model, that discretionary time is almost none. So that's our goal, is to increase our availability and our presence and that visibility that goes along with it. I think that is going to be one of the key components to really tackling some of our crime issues that we're seeing around property crime. I said enhancing community and officer safety. I think this is also a key component that you've probably heard a lot of stories around de-escalation and officers responding to calls. More officers on scene is actually de-escalates a lot of calls. There's less use of force when we have more officers. There's more confrontations when it's one officer trying to deal with a situation with a suspect. Suspect sees it as an opportunity to try and get away. The suspect sees an opportunity, I can overpower one officer. If there's 2 or 3 officers on scene, we have less confrontations. And there's a lot of studies that have been done on how an increase in staffing can actually help reduce the number of use of force incidents. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So again, traffic enforcement too. So the number one complaint that I get via email, via phone call is traffic related. The speeding in our community, in fact, we just got one today that was running red lights, the noisy mufflers, whatever, is related to traffic related complaints. Right now, with the number of officers that we have, and I talked about that discretionary time, we don't have a lot of capacity for traffic enforcement. Over the years, we've tried to do like special emphasis where we'll have an officer on overtime, go spend a few hours handling traffic only, target an area for a while. That might impact that particular street, maybe for a week or 2. We need sustained, dedicated traffic enforcement. The benefits behind that is it's still a uniformed officer, it's an officer in a marked car, they still have the capacity to go to 911 calls for service, but they're not going to handle the more routine calls. That's why they're going to have the opportunity to have time to focus on that traffic related incidents, to respond to accidents, to do hit and run follow-up investigations, handling accident investigations as well. So the intention is to add traffic enforcement officers. Let's go to the next slide. So over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about are we sending fully commissioned, armed, uniformed patrol officers to the right types of calls? And we really examined a lot of the calls that we get in the city here, and there's definitely a need a need for somebody that has a less commission, so a limited commission person, not a fully commissioned officer, they're not armed, that can go and respond to some of those lower level calls. We're talking about like panhandling type incidents, maybe a homeless individual. That is more of an opportunity to engage them and refer them for resources and work with the individual to see what it is that they need to get them out of that situation. Sending a uniformed officer to those types of calls changes the dynamic of the call. Certainly if I was the citizen and an officer's coming, whether we agree with it or not, that person is feeling like they did something wrong and they're going to be, under arrest, or they're being accused of doing something criminal. And that is not the case. And that's kind of the goal behind this type of a position, or one of the goals, is to have a person that can go out that is a representative of the city, that is dressed as a city employee, drives a city vehicle, and can engage these people and try and mitigate some of the problems that person is creating. Again, it's kind of a mitigation factor on some of our property crimes, because we find that there's a lot of instances that a lot of homeless people do commit crimes. They're committing the shoplifting, they're committing some of the vehicle prowl type stuff. So if we can engage them before they've committed those crimes, whether they're wanting to take our resources, but at least we're engaging with them, talking with them, and trying to get them moved on to a better situation versus sleeping on a park bench in Homestead, or sleeping under a business walkway at night. The other capacity that we're looking for this position is really heading up some crime prevention outreach with our businesses, with our homeowners, with our apartment complexes. Again, tackling some of this property crime issues. So if we can get out there, have a city employee engage with businesses, see what issues they're facing, be that kind of conduit with our patrol officers. Again, having conversations during the day with the businesses who can tell us, hey, at night we're seeing this, my cameras are catching this. It's not really a crime, but we can pass that information on to our graveyard officers who are working. And then, oh, okay, let's patrol this and let's try and make some sort of impact in that area. And again, this is a limited commission person, so they have the authority to be able to write tickets on city codes, so whether it's parking violations or any other type of violation of the city codes with animal control issues. They have that capacity, but we want to increase some of our visibility in our parks. Our parks are pretty heavily used, but we don't have the capacity, and it's probably not necessarily that we have our officers, fully commissioned officers, just sitting in parks and doing those types of patrols. Again, the calls for service are continuing to rise, and we want to focus their time more efficiently on doing criminal types of investigations. Let's go to the next for me. Hope you all can see that. So we've had 3-4 of these public listening sessions. We've received several emails. We've done some neighborhood talks. We've met with some church leaders and business leaders, and we've kind of gathered a lot of input from citizens and have talked about what the different options were. If you saw some of the initial flyers and stuff, it talked about that option A, which is right down the thing there on the screen for those of us that are here in person. It's hard to see. But that initial one that we talked about was 6 officers. We were going to add 6 commissioned staff members to the department to get us to that 22 number. There was a lot of people that said, well, is that enough? Based on everything that you're kind of telling me, really is that what we need as a community? If you've lived here in the city long enough, back in 2009, the city faced, as we all did, the recession. And they had to cut a lot of staff across the city. So that wasn't just the police department, it was in every department within the city. But they cut 9 positions. So that got us down to 15. So since that 2009 timeframe, we've regained 1 commissioned position. So we've been lagging behind for quite a few years as the demand and I'll say the rubber band of your officers is being stretched to capacity. So that initial option was what I would say was kind of the immediate Band-Aid. And as we've had conversations, people were like, is this really enough? And council had the same question. Okay, chief, really, what does more look like? And let's have that conversation. So there was an option B that got us back kind of close to that 2009 number. 2009, we had 24. So option B was 25. Then through some more conversation, 26, you can see that it's highlighted because that is my recommendation as your chief. What does that specifically do? If you look in the middle part of that chart, you can see day shift, swing shift, and grave shift. It gives us 6 officers on each one. Now that's not 6 officers on the street. That's 6 officers covering 7 days a week. So with 6, that allows us to have 3 officer minimum staffing. So we would have 3 on days, swing, and graveyard 24/7. It maintains that 2 officers in traffic enforcement. It still increases our investigations by 2 officers, one of those being a supervisor. And then it adds those community outreach officers. And you can see that that one has 2 positions. And the goal is to, again, provide 7-day coverage with only one person. Ideally, we're most likely looking at a 4-10 schedule, so they're working 4 out of the 7 days. The other person can work the other 4 days, and now we have an overlap. There's obviously a need on weekends. There's a need for this type of a position 7 days a week. And by having 2 of those types of officers, it also accommodates, vacation time, sick time, any type of training or anything that comes up. So we still maintain some capacity in that role. So these were the options that are being presented to council. As the mayor mentioned, this Monday night, the council will be making their final decision as to whether or not, if something will go to the ballot in November to all of you, and if so, what it will look like. And these are the things that they will be discussing, these different options, and then that is my recommendation within option B. I think that is the last slide. It is, you got it right. Should get it right, it's the fourth time doing this, right? So now I want to open it up to questions. I know there's plenty of questions, but just feel free to ask any questions. Yes?
I understand that the apartments on Mildred are part of University Place, the new ones that are going in for the bowling
Correct. The old
alleys.
bowling alley?
Yes. And then 27th and Grandview, there's more apartments going in there. Is that true?
Yeah, I think the 27th and Grandview is still a ways off, but I think that's planned as a 55 and over, but I believe it is,
Senior citizens.
yeah,
Okay.
senior apartments.
Are you anticipating any impact of all of those apartments on public safety?
Yeah, actually, I think we have a slide that, I'll bring this up because you can have some of that data. So we looked actually, I think it was in relation to the Mildred project. I did a survey of apartments in the University Place of the 5 different complexes and looked at calls for service. And what we found is, you know, it's not apartment complexes themselves that create more, it's just people create more calls for service and demands. So in this scenario, you can see that apartments basically might have 100 units in one building. And you compare that to a neighborhood that has 100 single-family homes. They actually generate about the same number of calls. What the challenge that we might face as public safety is, I have one apartment complex next to another apartment complex and another one, so we actually have you'll see that where our activity from public safety is concentrated. So 70th Avenue near Mildred, Hannah Pierce over towards 56 and Cirque, some of the apartments off of Bridgeport here in Fort. I mean, those are, you'll see if you look at our heat map, that's where we have a lot of activity because we have a very good concentration of people. So it's not necessarily the apartments themselves, it's just more of the fact that we have a concentration of people.
Will those apartments generate tax revenue that will go towards public safety?
Yeah, and I'll try and answer this, but unless Eric wants it right now. He'll probably stand up and correct me, but so yeah, this has been a question that we've had at Everything Else is talking about apartment complexes and what they pay compared to single family. Everybody pays the same rate as far as a property tax, whether it's commercial, single family, or multifamily properties. And the renters get that passed on from whoever owns that complex, right? So if the property tax rate goes up, that's going to be passed on to their renters, of course. Maybe they don't, but it's still going to be charged to that owner. So they are being charged at the same amount. And the other thing that I learned too is we also get some sales tax generated from anything that's bought online. It's now sales tax is at the point of where you make the online purchase from, so where it is shipped to. So that helps increase some of the revenues from the sales tax. Did I miss anything on that one? Okay.
Just a quick question, just as a follow-up to that question, or a point. The apartments, I understand there's a lot seem to be going up in UP. But isn't it true, and I'm assuming that the city of UP is no different than other communities, the city council has offered incentives to the developers, property tax abatement for a period of time. So, I mean, I just don't think not saying you're being disingenuous, but when it comes time to the revenue side, because that's some of the questions I've got.
Sure.
Is that you're looking at one component part here of the puzzle, and I get that.
Yeah.
And I don't think I don't believe, probably not many of us here have a concern about additional officers probably that are needed in UP. However, my questions are, it's the other portions, the fire.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I look at anyway, that's this, I want to get
Okay.
back to that
Yeah,
original
we'll talk.
question. And that is you've given the city fathers to build these structures. You've given incentives, and my understanding is that it's, I don't know if it's being passed on to the renters, but the developers, they have either a 10 to 12 to a 15-year period where they're not paying, or they're paying a reduced tax amount. Is
Yeah.
that true or not true?
Oh, hey, all right. Very, yeah, got my back up.
That is both true and not true. So we have 3 built projects in UP right now that have the tax exemption. One is located here, there's another one here, and then another one there. So the rest of them that currently exist don't have that exemption. And we did some analysis, what's the council wants to know, what are we giving up and what are we getting for that? And so they have passed a multifamily tax exemption that only applies to the housing portion of the development. So any commercial part still pays tax and the land value still pays tax. And so we looked at these 3 projects and we said, okay, before they existed, how much were we getting in property tax? Which of course all goes to public safety. And that was $7,500 a year. When you look at just the tax on the land, because once you build something, the land value tends to go up. So the new assessed value on the land and the assessed value on the commercial portion, and it's just of these buildings, even though these buildings help spark these other, purely commercial buildings, just the multifamily buildings, we're collecting $23,000 a year in property tax. So and it's an 8-year abatement. So for an 8-year period, we're collecting 3 times as much money as we were collecting before. And at the end of that 8-year period, we'll be collecting another about $55,000. So it is, from a property tax perspective, worth giving it up. But more importantly, the city has multiple objectives here, right? So we have said, we'll give this abatement in exchange for certain other things. We want a higher level of design. We want, other things that are important, because in the end, we have to accept more growth. We have to zone for more growth. This is state mandates. So, there are trade-offs here. Last point I'll make is the chief mentioned, as you see in the last 2 bullet points, 0.9 calls, whether it be single family or it be multifamily. The chief and Jennifer did some analysis to say, okay, well, looking at these new buildings, what are their calls for service? And their calls for service are about half that. So they're paying as much as a single family house. Their calls for service are about half as much as a single family house. And the tax abatement that the city has given for an 8-year period generates 3 times as much money as we were collecting before. So, they're give and takes here, but that's kind of what the city council has chosen to do.
Yeah, I'd like to just make a couple of points. I think, we have an aberration with the pandemic. So it seems to me that the increase on one of the slides is a function of that, people losing jobs and a variety. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I think that will mitigate to one degree or another as time goes on, and we get to more normalcy in terms of our life. But most importantly, I think University Place is in serious danger of outpricing people's homes. You've got people on fixed income. They raised the price of my house $100,000 in a year, okay? I'd like to see a chart up there from 09 that shows the ad valorem or real estate tax increases for that last decade or so. Because the truth of the matter is, when they raise property values, 100,000 of assessed value, somewhere along the line, there's got to be some expenditure factored in there for the police. And I don't understand coming with a levy on top of $100,000 property tax increase. And I can afford it. And everybody complains about taxes. I understand that. But we're getting dangerously close to people moving because they say university places like Malibu, you can buy the house, but the taxes kill you. And so that's something I hope that consideration and mindfulness of the impact on people, particularly those that have lived here for 25 years, as in my case, because that's so counterproductive that it's kind of like a fool's errand, that you think, well, we've solved this problem by raising taxes and doing it appropriately. Then you find out that you're going to undercut your solid tax base. And I'm not saying that's happening. I'm saying it appears to me that it's foreseeable. So, and one last thing, and then I'll shut up. When I studied economics, I was told the theory of taxation is by a French philosopher named Say, and he said the idea is to get the most amount of feathers out of the goose with the least amount of hissing. And so the reality here, I would consider this, not that anyone's outrageous or it's, you know, not a brawl, but there is some merit to that. It's pithy and it's cute, but the reality of the situation is taxes are really a concern to most people that live here in University Place. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Yeah,
Real quick, Chief, I want to go back to the slide that had the comparison property tax, local property tax. Not that one, that one. So I just want to clarify, so the dollar figures you see there are based off the assessed value that year. So this isn't just, you know, a house at $100,000 going all the way across, even though property values have gone up. This is computing it based off of in 2000, what was the property value, average home value at that time, 2000, so those are real dollars.
Well, respectfully, so is the amount percentage of your disposable income that comes out to pay not only the ad valorem and real estate taxes, but you got sales taxes and, you know, the normal things. And don't get me wrong, University Place is a fabulous place to live for a lot of reasons, okay? But the fact of the matter is that taxes are, they're a bite, and they're not going down. And I mean, I think anybody that thinks they're going to go down is, well, is wrong. So it's a lot of money. And
Can I ask a question? So it's really is consistent with what he was saying. So you mentioned something that by law the taxes can't go up more than 1%. Is that 1% per thousand assessed value? Okay.
No, so it's
So if my taxes were $6,000 this past year, they can't go up more than $60 this coming year. No, that's not right.
So Washington State has a complicated tax formula. So when I say 1%, so if the city collected $1 million last year in property tax, we're only allowed to collect $10,000 more, $10,000 more the following year. How that affects an individual property owner depends on how much of their property appreciated versus everyone else's.
Well, I think that many of us here did see $100,000.
Yes, so if your property went up,
So how much will that translate into a rise in our property taxes? And the reason why this is important, because if we're going to see a significant amount of taxes that we'll be paying, is this the proper time to put another levy on us? Or from that pot of extra hundreds of thousands of dollars, can that not go in to support? And I agree that it sounds like we need more police force. And I appreciate what you all do, but I don't know. I come from Virginia. 4 years ago, I moved here. In Virginia, if our home's assessment went up considerably, the tax rate dropped by, from like 0.97 to 0.96. There was still an increase in total tax collected, but I don't understand the system here. And I'm just concerned that if our homes are going up 20%, will our taxes therefore go up 20%, and then you want to add a levy on top of that? So that's what I need clarification about.
so Amanda, can you pull up the chart that shows the tax rate over time? The long story short is it would be similar to Virginia. So if let's say your house is worth $100,000 and your property appreciates by $100,000, 100% increase. If everyone else's on average increased by 100%, you would pay 1% more, even though your property went up by 100%.
Okay.
So I know a lot of people are concerned that,
So
hey, we know that the property values have gone up by 20% over the past year in some areas. If yours appreciated along with the average, your taxes will only go up by 1% unless you vote for something different.
Okay, so that looks like you do compensate by lowering the tax rate per thousand if there's a market increase in value.
Correct.
That really is helpful, thank you.
We had extra hands. Yes, sir.
Yeah, don't sit down there. Come on. Well, I've got something for him too.
Oh, sure.
This has to do just with the nuts and bolts of how this levy affects. I feel fortunate then, I just got my green postcard and my tax only went up 15% as opposed to the 20 these people are talking about. But when you folks figured out with this many add-ons, what it was that for the taxes that are on the books now in 22, or have you already looked ahead to what's in 23? And since the levy won't become effective till 23, you're getting a bigger bite. So let's play with some numbers as to what it means in the first year, and then as our property values go up, does that mean the levy that's taken out is going to increase, or is it solidified at whatever the rate was in 2023, if you understand that question?
So we just heard just recently from the assessor's office what the increase for UP will be. And so we're going to take that all into consideration when we go to council ultimately and say this is the rate that we're seeking. So the idea is to raise enough money to pay for the officers that the chief laid out and have enough money to pay for those people through the middle of the next decade, basically. There's a lot of uncertainty as it relates to that. Obviously, 10.1% was the average inflationary cost in this region. So we're going to have to look at that as well to make sure that our guesstimates on what the inflation rates will be going forward. So all of that will be taken into consideration. So we're not trying to gather a lot more money than we need to support the program that the chief laid out.
Okay, but let's just say with the levy, well, I don't know how to say this. I've got a property of a certain value, and you're going to factor that in with a multiplier to figure out how much my property pays in taxes.
No, so that's not done by the city, that's done by the
Regardless
county.
of who it's done by.
So what happens is that we're going to say our levy rate should go from here to here. And
Can you give me some hypotheticals of what that is now and what it's going to go to?
to give you hypotheticals or?
Yeah, just say, okay.
So like
say
it's
that
right now,
1%
it's at
now
78 cents, and we're going to say it should go to $1.09.
with the advance.
And then, but we're going to, between now and the time the council votes on this, we're going to be doing some calculations to make sure that based off of what we know, what we think is going to happen with assessed values, what we're thinking is happening with inflation, that we have the right number that makes sense.
For right now, but then when 2024 gets here and if more green postcards come up and the values are increased, are you going to have a new multiplier against that?
No, because we're
increase?
still subject to the 1% limitation thereafter. So we raise the rate to $1.09, that generates a certain amount of money. Then from there, that point on out, we can only collect 1% more on that amount of money each
So
year.
it would be 109 the 1 year, 110 because that's.
The rate may go up and down depending on what property values do. We can only decide how much money we can collect. So you mentioned, for example, that your property value went up by 15%. If the average went up by 20-some%, you're actually going to get a tax cut next year. Even though your property went up 15%, yours didn't go up with the average. So, well, as I mentioned, Washington State has a very complicated system, and it's all based off of how does your property value increase relative to the average. And make sure that the jurisdiction can't collect more than 1% than they did the previous year.
But is that going to be if, on one of the examples, was it $20 a month or 20?
Yeah.
Okay, so $20 a month.
For the
next
average
year-
house.
For the average house. The next year, if the average house changes, is that going to go up to $22 a month?
It will be for the
$23 a
average
month?
house, it will be 1% more.
But whatever that is, it will keep going up every year. It's not frozen at
It will be
20,
1%
23
more.
levels. I think that's what people are interested in. What is it going to cost over the life of this, which has no end?
Correct, it has no end, and it'll be 1% more than the previous year.
$20.20 problem.
Right.
Let me ask one quick one.
Wait, we had someone over
Oh, I'm
here
sorry.
first.
So it sure sounds like you answered this question. Research Initiative 747, it was in our state probably 2 decades ago. You'll learn a lot about what you're asking about. I just wanted to ask some clarifying questions about a lot of the slides you showed.
Okay.
Based on the quick math I did here, it looks like our property crime from 21 to 22 has gone up by 29%. That's a third increase in property crime. CPI was mentioned at 10.1%, but the city is limited to 1%, 1/10 of inflation. Keep that in context. Violent crimes up across the county, I don't know if you guys know that, but we need investigative support here because what exists in the county is being stretched thin, and we're a small player. The chief just explained that we don't have a lot of violent crime. I'm astounded that we only have 1 additional staff since 2009. 1 more police officer in over a decade. Keep that in context. I do have a quick question for you, Chief. That's not clarifying. What's the industry standard for officers per 1,000? Does that exist like it does in a lot of industries?
There's not necessarily an industry standard, because like I said, you can look at, it's not one measure, one formula that we use. We look at what's the average, and the average is 1.19 in Washington for cities between 20 and 60,000. And this is another chart.
Just to reframe that, we're just under half of what this state's average is.
Correct.
So we have 1/2 person per 1,000.
Correct.
Hopefully it's the top half, because that's the brain.
That's the brain part? Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
What rate does the contract go up for the sheriff's department? I think at one meeting you mentioned it's $180,000 package per officer. And so if inflation is 10% a year, did they raise it at that rate?
No. One, you mentioned 180,000, and I want to clarify that's not the salary. When we contract with the sheriff, it covers all costs for that officer. So there's a flat one cost, and it covers their car, their training, their uniforms, everything, the liability insurance, and everything for that officer. The current contract with the sheriff, it caps out at 6% per year as the maximum. And I think it's been 3% pretty much every year of the contract until this last year. The county came and said, we're going to hit the maximum for this year and do 6%.
But no, the county has come and talked to us and said, hey, by the way, we're entering negotiations with our union for a new union contract. Just fair warning to you, we want more than 6%. They haven't told us what that amount is, but you can expect that.
Right, but
they're
even if they just
possible.
kept it at 6%, you're only going to go up 1%.
Yes.
First, I wouldn't want your job. But for getting back to the point, if the council does not vote to put this on, what are we left with? I mean, we have to have it. We cannot continue to have the low rate of police officers here. It's just not realistic. I'm not joyful at my age and more money for this, but I feel I'm not joyful with a lot of things. Because to protect myself, my neighbors, there is no other choice. Unless somebody here has one.
Yeah, very well said. And so for those who couldn't hear, the question was about what do we do if the council doesn't move this to the voters, and that's kind of part of my concern is we've gone since 2009, we've had added 1. I think this is an opportunity for citizens to make a decision whether or not they want to invest in public safety in their community. The concerns around public safety are not isolated to University Place, and thankfully we are only addressing property crimes as our biggest concern. It doesn't mean that we don't have violent crime issues from time to time. We are located between Lakewood and Tacoma, and it's very common for us to get some of those issues that come into our city. And the more that and the other thing I want to talk about is the hiring. I'm sure there might have been a question that was coming. I'm going to jump to that a little bit. You know, there's a challenge going on right now trying to get applicants to go into this line of work, this career field. I'm optimistic that it's going to change, that over the span of the next year that we're going to see more applicants coming. And we're seeing a little bit of an uptick already, but I think the value of public safety and some of the changes that have been enacted over the last year and a half have helped. People are seeing the value of it, and that we've made some reforms that make people more willing to come into this line of work. But we wait, so even if we put this on the ballot in November and we start collecting a tax, we're still not looking at officers on the street until the end of next year, because we have to hire them, train them, and get them out here, and it still takes time. So we keep putting this off. We say not now in November, or if it fails, then you have to wait how much longer, and then how much more behind are we going to become? Right now, and I'm not a fan of this, but we push a lot of calls that come in that people want to make reports about vehicle prowls or thefts. We push you to online reporting. We don't send officers out to those calls. I am not a fan of that. This city started back with the idea of no call too small. We started with 3 officers on every shift, and we sent officers to every single call to engage with the citizen, get their information, do a proper investigation. We keep falling behind and getting more calls and less officers, and we're having to push you to try and do that on your own through an online system. It's convenient for some. Some people like it, and I'm not saying I'd take it away as not the option, but citizens, your average citizen is not a report writer. They're not a criminal investigator. They don't know what to put in there. And I think it impacts public safety when we don't have that direct engagement with an officer. We still review those reports, and we still try to decipher those reports as to whether or not we can do something with it. But we need to get back to where we're having officers responding to all those types of calls and conducting an investigation as whether or not we can do something on those. So the more we kick the can and say we need to, I don't know if there ever is a right time to talk about taxes and increasing taxes. I'm a taxpayer too. But I still think it's the right time for this community to make that decision. Since I was started as your chief in 2019, I get the phone calls about what's going on, and I explain, I have 2 officers, we're going to do what we can, and then they complain about why don't I have more officers? This is ridiculous. This is just going to be an opportunity for the citizens to decide, do they want more, do they want to invest in public safety going forward? Yes?
Okay, this is slightly with what you're speaking about. Because a few years ago, my son had his pickup stolen. He was out of town, came at the apartment he was at, they called him, hey, by the way, we noticed someone broke into your pickup. He's like, well, I parked it in the front because I was going to be out of town. I mean, did you call the police? They're like, well, that's not our problem, that's your problem. He calls, I don't know who he calls, but he's out of town. He has to make the phone call. When you get back into town, give us a call. I'm over here like, but it's been broken into. Why can't someone go and look? That was my biggest thing. Now I understand. He gets back, and first it was broken into. He gets back, and it's completely gone. And it was found about 9 months later. It was used as a derby car. It had more dents and who knows what. And my son's like, well, did you find who stole it? They're like, well, we're not going to look for whoever stole it because they won't prosecute. And I think this is where it comes down to city prosecutors and your police officers, because, I mean, you may do all the reports, you may do everything correctly, but if you don't have the backing of the city prosecutors putting these people away to keep them from doing what they've done, I mean, if there's no punishment, then...
There's certainly a lot of challenges. Every case is kind of unique, right?
Yeah.
There's got to be the right amount of evidence that a prosecutor is going to say, yep, I can take that to trial, and I'm confident that a jury is going to find this person guilty of that. And they have to weigh it with all the other cases that they're dealing with. we have 2 prosecutors that we deal with. So for misdemeanor and gross misdemeanor crimes, we have a city prosecutor that we work directly with. It's a city employee, and we work on that consulting together about whether or not charges are filed and what is needed for that. Felony level cases, such as stealing a car, that goes to the county prosecutor's office. And that county prosecutor is an elected official. We can advocate for our case as best we can as a law enforcement officer, and we try, they give us like, hey, these are the elements that we need to try and to file charges, and we try to meet those, but we really don't have a lot of control as to whether or not they ultimately will file charges. And sometimes cases just don't give us enough evidence that we're even comfortable pushing it to a prosecutor. We just got to work with what is available. And stolen cars is really a tough one in this state because there's an element within the statute that says that person has to know that the car is stolen, or you catch them in the act of stealing it. So a lot of times they're driving a stolen car. It doesn't mean that they automatically go to jail. We have to try and prove that they knew that that car was stolen, which isn't always easy because they just say, Fred gave it to me. But yeah. Yeah.
So if you had more officers and more investigative capabilities in town, technically you could spot trends or maybe know that the same person seems to be committing all these car thefts. And so when you submitted a case to the prosecutor, then it could possibly be stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to tell a quick story that this was just a couple days, about a week ago. I got a phone call from these forum flyers. A woman called in and said, I had my lawnmower stolen out of my garage in the middle of the night. I found it at the pawn shop. But she just did it. It was like, so she just did the report, right? And so I signed it to our investigator and said, hey, can you take a look at this? So we went down to the pawn shop, and I don't want to give you the whole long story, but my point is he got video. This person had video at their house, like a Ring camera type thing. Got the video, and he was like, wait a minute, that's the same guy who burglarized the storage unit over here. I mean, they're the same person. And so it's just understanding that it takes resources to do that. I can't dedicate a patrol officer to go over to that. It takes an investigator time to go collect that video, review it, go to the other one, get that video, and then we went to the pawn shop because pawn shops are required to get identification. And so we're putting all those pieces together and trying to put that case together. And so yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we have to do, but I just wanted to share that takes resources to do that. Yes, sir.
So recently, the city council passed a utility tax, which went from 3% last year to 6%, which the power portion of that, as I understand, was dedicated to public safety. So how does that work into everything we're talking about tonight?
It's the water portion that went to public safety.
Water?
And
okay.
all of the estimates that we've put in assume that utility tax is part of the overall public safety fund. So we mentioned, of course, that all property taxes are dedicated to public safety. There are some other revenue sources in addition to that. But for example, I think the water utility tax is about $600,000 a year versus the property tax is $4.6 million a year. So it's a relatively speaking, a smaller portion of that. The total public safety budget is about 40%, almost 40% of our operating budget. And property taxes are number one single largest tax, and it's all dedicated.
Yes.
So how many guys are you running on day shift?
Two officers.
2 on day shift, and what, swing shift?
2.
2, and then graveyard is 2. Okay. So, give you a scenario here. You go to a physical domestic, you make an arrest. One of those officers has to take them all the way to Pierce County Jail to book them. You're looking at a 20-minute drive. Who knows how long it takes to book, depending on how long they're backed up. Another 20-minute drive here. At some point, they're going to have to write a 45-minute report somewhere. So if another physical domestic or some sort of other emergent call comes up while that officer is taking care of business, does that call pend, or does Furcrest come in, or does Lakewood come in? And if they, I know the mutual aid law, but what's the line where you actually have another officer coming in to take care of those calls?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. We just had this a couple weeks ago. So a business owner called in because he was complaining about the response. This was in the middle of the day. there was a group of unruly juveniles at Green Firs causing a problem. They were throwing rocks at the windows. It was an early out day and they were just being a problem. But staff was concerned at the business and customers were concerned, and he called in. And it was an hour before. Actually, we never actually did respond to it because 911 just called him back after an hour and said, how are things going? And he's like, well, they finally left after 45 minutes or so. But as I was answering his call and I looked, I said, well, this is a case of, I'll say bad timing, but it's bad timing that's happening more frequently. Both officers were on a domestic call in the middle of the day over off Hannah Pierce where they had to make an arrest. At the same time that they were there, we had a report, somebody called in that they had shot their mom in the head over here. So Fircrest helped us out and started to head over to that call. And the other officer one went to the jail, the other one then came over here to help the Fircrest officer to come over to help us. Now thankfully, the phone call was a mental health issue, the person had not been shot, so, but we don't know that, right? We have to respond as if it's truth, and we go and we investigate it. But while we're doing that call, we had a strong arm robbery at 19th and Bridgeport at one of the businesses where an individual, probably a homeless guy, came in, grabbed all the tip jar and pushed people out of the way, and there was a physical assault and took off on foot. Couldn't respond to that one because our Fircrest officer was helping us over here, and the other one's still at the jail. So when we got done with the shooting thing and realizing everybody was okay and it was just a mental health type thing, they responded to the strong arm robbery because that takes precedent over some juveniles in that situation. And again, by all this time, now we're pushing an hour and we call in. And that's where I'm talking about availability. Having 2 officers is a challenge as far as 70% of our calls require 2 officers. Having that third officer available to go to that second call as it comes in, and we do have a good relationship with Fircrest. I would say we abuse that relationship. They come over and back us up on calls frequently. They'll come over and handle like alarms at houses. When our guys are on a call, they'll come over and handle an alarm. If there's some sort of a disturbance in a parking lot, they'll come over and do those things. We really advocate that we still don't want one officer going to 2-person calls. It's as much as I tell them, don't do it, they do it anyway because they don't want to see the call penned, they don't want to see something happen that shouldn't happen, and they'll do their best to intervene as safely as possible with just one of them. So that's just the fact of the way things are going, and it's getting busier for us with those types of calls. We're not immune to some of the challenges around homelessness and substance abuse issues that a lot of other communities are facing. The transit system, sometimes is just that for us. They stop here in Bridgeport and you get off and we have those challenges. Yes, ma'am.
So this might be an example of that. Yesterday about 5 p.m. off 84th and Cirque, I witnessed probably a mental health emergency. You're probably aware of it. And I probably counted at least 8 officers, 8 cars, everything. So if we only had 2 officers on duty, who were the other officers that came in and supported that call?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so our staffing with 4 officers, if everybody is here, so there's no vacation, no sick, no training, of those 7 days, you get 5 days of 2 officers and 2 days where we have 3 officers. But I can't tell you the last time I had 3 officers working because at some point somebody is taking, vacation day, training, or sick day, right? So the potential there's 3 was working from us, but at 5 o'clock all we had was swing shifts, so there's probably only 2. Could have had Fircrest, 1 or 2 from Fircrest that came over. Like I said, they come over all the time to help us. Outside of that, it's either another officer driving home that heard the call and is going to assist. It possibly was Lakewood. We don't really do mutual aid with Lakewood or Tacoma very often. They're on a different radio frequency, and they're really busy. So I couldn't answer. I didn't look at the call particularly to see who was responding on that. A lot of times too, fire and us get confused. They just see a lot of bodies in blue and they just think, all that is police because our cars are more noticeable or people pay attention. And fire tends to show up. They bring a crew with them. So that could have been it. Any other, oh, yes. Oh, here in there.
This is almost a specific question, but that can affect many sorry about my allergies, in different ways. You probably already know the answer, but the expenses of installing something like a traffic speed monitor. One example is on the west side of Orchard, southbound, of course. And my understanding since the 68 years I've been in University Place, that the center line is Tacoma on the east, University Place on the west in that area. And I'm just wondering about the feasibility of doing something like that. Many times I've wished that I had the funds to do it, because I figured if it was monitored in the way of people actually having to pay fines, then that could either lower or maintain my property tax amount. And I just don't know if, for example, the expense of doing something like that could be funded by civilians getting together, just how much it would be.
Yeah, so for those who couldn't hear, the question was about like speed cameras, and I'll expand it to red light cameras and those types of, any type of traffic enforcement. We've had conversations internally about school zone speed cameras, and we've looked into those. There's certainly nothing that citizens need to be funding. Honestly, the money that those things generate will pay for the item itself. They generate plenty of revenue to cover those expenses. So we've only had conversations around school zone cameras. We haven't really expanded the conversation to cover just general speed areas or the red light ones. And there's actually ones that you can get for stop signs. You can get them for noise. There's all kinds of ones that are out there. I'm certainly a proponent of utilizing technology as much as we can as a force multiplier because of limited resources. The other aspect of it from a financial standpoint is a regular ticket that is written by an officer. If the average is $129, the city's getting about $48 of that. The rest is going to the state. Some of it goes to the court itself. Any of the camera tickets, we get all but $10 of it, and the council gets to decide what that fee adjustment is. Eric, did you have something you want to add to that one?
I'm
you're sneaking up on me. I was like,
I'll play the role of our city attorney here. He's far more knowledgeable in this stuff than I am. I do not believe outside of school zones and red light zones, and now there's a few exceptions for crosswalk violations and stuff like in Seattle. I don't think that they're allowed in general rights of way. So it's a very limited number of places that you could put a speed camera.
Even like down on Leech Creek on Bridgeport, where there's a reminder for folks. I doubt that that's being passed on as basically a ticket. But when people are doing 60 and above in a 35 zone on Orchard, it concerns me, especially with so many people coming out onto Orchard from developments that are in that area.
yeah. And don't confuse just the radar signs that you see that tell you your speed and stuff. Those are just, there's no connection to those. That is just literally a warning sign to help
It does seem
conscious
to
people,
affect
but
people though, when they're...
yeah, sometimes it helps. Sometimes it encourages people to see how fast they can make that number go up. That just, I guess, depends on where you're coming from. Yes, sir.
So Eric was saying that for like a speed camera to pick up to 4 tickets, like some communities have, that's not possible, or it's challenging to have.
They did just pass new legislation around it.
Like a drag strip, and nothing's being done because you're limited on your resources. Wouldn't it be more cost effective to put up red light cameras? And that's I don't know who doesn't notice that people, I mean, it's constant. You can count 2 or 3 cars at every stoplight. 27th is very bad. You mentioned that at the very first meeting. 40th is not much better, but that would free up officers. You pay a company. I mean, even if they take most of the money, at least. The traffic's slower. Because from, I live on 24th, and from 27th down to about 24th, 25th, you know, the motorcycles, the cars, it's easy 100 miles an hour. I mean, on one of those motorcycles, you can do 60 miles an hour easy in first gear. And that's constant. But there again, I know you don't have the resource, but if it's farmed out, then you get your plan, like I hope you will, that frees up officers. Other emergencies.
Yeah.
And just pretty soon, I mean, who drives 40 through Fircrest? Or DuPont, Stillicum, or 30? Right, no, that doesn't happen.
Right.
And once you do, now you know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have a lot of communities like that, from here up into King County, that are, you know, not to drive fast.
And when I talk about camera systems, what I like to say is it's not the solution, right? Because it's going to be for a targeted area, but it does help kind of promote a culture within your community about traffic safety. Like, I don't know about you, but when I know where all the cameras are, and as I'm like, oh, that reminds me, I gotta watch my speed, I gotta slow down, otherwise I'm gonna get it. I might brake for that yellow, and I might not, another time, but it's not the solution. It's not the only solution. It is probably one solution to help with the problem. And I think that right now the conversation is about staffing, but there needs to be a conversation following that as to how do we implement that certainly within the school zones, because we've already done some studies, and there's plenty of evidence that we have a speeding problem, and even during flashing lights that say school zone time frames.
And the buses do not have cameras, like some communities.
I don't believe so. You're talking about for stop paddle?
Correct.
Yes, I know. I just had a short conversation about that.
Bethel used to do it.
What's that?
Bethel used to do it.
Bethel still, I think, still uses those. I've already spoken with the school district saying if that's their program, they pay for the installation of that. The thing that people don't realize is every ticket, even a camera ticket, has to be reviewed by an officer who has to log into the system, review the video, review the data, and sign off on it and send it to the court. It's not a huge task. And I've mentioned to the school district that if they implemented those, we would certainly take on that role to make it happen on our end. But if we started adding school zone cameras, I have to have an officer that is available within their time to log in and review everything and send it to the court. And that's one of the things that we would do with traffic officers, is that be part of their day, is reviewing those.
Is it required to be a officer?
Unfortunately, it is by statute. There was a legislative push, I think might not have been the last one, it was the one before that, but they were trying to get it to be at least a limited commission person, but it didn't make it through the state. The state has to grant it by statute. And right now, is the way the law is written, it has to be a fully commissioned officer that signs on tickets.
Well, we went for a walk today on Bridgeport from 24th to the next street, 23rd, to go to the park over on 19th by Merrill Gardens. And it was like you're walking down the side of the freeway, I-5. I mean, that close.
Yeah.
And and I'm kind of surprised is the speed limits in some areas are reasonable. I mean, that should be for some residential, it's 25 on main streets, and others are, like even out here at, right out in front here, it's 30 miles an hour. Well, you have cars stopping, they're going to back up. I've seen fender benders, I've seen people yell at each other, and I don't know if that's a 30 miles an hour road anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're stopping in traffic to back up, I mean, there's a lot of situations around UP that could be, reevaluated.
Yeah. I know that the traffic engineering department here, when we get those kind of complaints come in, they'll go out and set out the survey lines to try and gauge the speeds of cars that are coming through and making those adjustments. I think the improvements on Cirque, I think, was a good example for those that are down there. So we put in new sidewalks and new street lights and stuff down Cirque towards Grandview, and during construction, they lowered the speed limit down to 30, and I think the afterwards went, boy, this is actually a good speed, let's keep it at 30. Now, that doesn't mean everybody goes 30, but
No.
but they did an assessment and made some of those changes, which I think they thought would, help for
Yeah. There is
pedestrian
no
safety.
electronic speed control on, from 27th to 19th.
On Bridgeport?
Northbound, southbound, either. Yes.
Yeah.
Why, I don't know. They're in neighborhoods, but that's a neighborhood, it just has a
Right, just a main
four-lane
thoroughfare
road
going
there,
through
but
it.
it is residential. And there are school buses, there's children on the corners for pickup and delivery back home.
Yeah.
So, but, yeah, it's a
I'm sorry.
problem.
Yeah.
Not to
Didn't mean cut you off.
belabor the point, but if I don't make it to the next meeting, it's probably because someone rear-ended me when I tried to make a right-hand turn onto my dead end off of Orchard. And I have a special technique, but it isn't going to work every time.
Any other? Yes, sir.
Is there something unique about University Place? I'm not aware of, I knew, relatively new, came to Big Harbor, born and raised in Tacoma. I'm not aware of a public safety levy. And I guess the question I've got to you is, or maybe would be more appropriate to Councilman Keel or whoever else is here, is how did we get to this point? I mean, if I remember my reading, when the city of UP was created, the budget officer said, hey, we can provide all the services, and there's not going to be a problem. I mean, UP is not a downscale, it's an upscale community. And I just don't, is there something about them? The one thing I see, we were concentrating on the one expense side, law enforcement. I support totally. But what I'm not sure I support is the allocation of the rest of the dollars that are being spent by the council. And I wish I saw some handouts. Is there something unique about UP? Are we having to pay an inordinate amount of our revenue for debt service, for prior mistakes that may have been made by prior city councils?
So every city is unique, right? Our city has several challenges. So you talked about Gig Harbor, a city of maybe 6,000 people. They drew their boundaries of their city quite small to exclude a lot of residential and mainly include the commercial, because those areas generate a lot of sales tax and tend to have less in the way of demands and services. So UP does not have a lot of retail. And the whole idea of redeveloping this town center was to bring in retail to help offset some of the tax burden on residents. So there are a number of suburban communities that just simply have a overall higher property tax rate because they don't have a lot of sales tax or utility taxes or other taxes that would offset some of that. You still have a lot of the same service costs, so more people you have, the more officers you need because there's where the service demands are. But it's basically the mix between your various revenue sources. The chief mentioned back in 2009, we cut a third of our staff across the board. Because we did have a debt problem, and we still are paying on that debt, so that helped build all of this.
So there is that is a component.
That is certainly a component of this.
Debt service that's unusual.
Yeah, I don't know how unusual it is. I mean, there are cities that build, public infrastructure all the time. But certainly, we do have debt here related to the building of this town center that was incurred by previous councils. But it's a long-term debt, so whoever's on the council, that's one of the things they have to operate within, one of the structures they operate within. So the council balances that. Then we have statutory obligations that every city has. So I'd be happy to sit down with you. We can go through line by line of the budget, and I could show you that when you look at our other revenues, there's not a lot of revenues that can be siphoned off to go towards their otherwise number one priority, which is police. I mentioned that 40% of our operating budget's going to police. We still have statutory obligations to perform all these various other services, whether it be permitting, planning, public records, all the other normal things that cities are required to do. Cities technically aren't required to have police officers. They aren't required to pave the roads. They aren't required to do a lot of other things that people regard as priorities, when instead the state tells us these other things are priorities. So we have to do these things first, pay for our debts first, and that leaves what's left. And what we're saying is what's left is enough to sustain our current force, but not enough to add officers. And anyone who has any question about the budget, be happy to sit down. We can schedule a meeting and we'll be happy to go through it with you. We do have resources available on our website. So if you click on Finance Department, our entire budget's there. You can look through. We try to draft it in a way that's understandable to, non-technocrats. So, but I'd be happy to meet with you.
And unique about University Place, I think, when you talk about Gig Harbor has 18 officers currently and I think their population is closer to 10 right now. But retail does draw a lot of resources in terms of, like, your big box stores and stuff can draw a lot from public safety. They generate calls for service around thefts and those types of things. So we're unique in that we're very much a bedroom kind of suburban community, and that changes the whole taxing structure, I think, around what the city can collect. So it's a little bit different. Again, kind of talking about, that's why there is no one formula to determine what our staffing needs to be. Yes. Yeah.
I don't want to belabor that point either, but the gentleman who left who mentioned that University Place was a great place, I would have appreciated sharing with him that yes, it was a great place before it was incorporated, and many things were done correctly. I realize time changes, people change, there are more people here, etc. But if any one of you had had an opportunity to be here since 1954 and seen the changes, you would understand.
Yes.
So, even though I'm late, I've been watching your presentation on YouTube live since 6 p.m. So, I'm a parent of a Curtis High School student, and my biggest concern is this. I watched the video of what happened in the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, where there's a bunch of officers standing outside of the classroom. So I do believe that quantity matters, but also quality matters more. So I hope we'll never have to find out. But what is the proper response if there's ever an active shooting at UP schools?
Boy, that's probably an hour or 2 hour discussion to talk about what it is, and I probably don't need to get into too many of the tactics, but what I can tell you for us is we do active shooter training at least every other year. We've been doing it once a year, and the way we train active shooter response is if there's what's called active shooting, so if the officers are arriving and they can hear it, we train them to go in with, it can be one, but minimum of two are going to go in, and they're going to address the shooter as quickly as possible. And I haven't watched the video and I don't know all the stuff from down there. I just have heard some of the news reportings on it, but that's how we're trained to go, is to go in, and as soon as you get there and get at least two of you together and go that way, we train it to expand that, so when there's more officers available, they train on how to navigate and go in and address those issues. I think that's also one of the key components to having an SRO in the schools, is because they're very familiar with the schools, how they're made up, the hallways, the classrooms, and all those types of things. And so having an SRO as a part of that response is very key in being able to communicate things and help to expedite that response from the officers. Again, I'm not here to comment on how the Texas people responded to theirs. I don't know all the details of it. I can just tell you about how we train, and we train to go when there's shooting that's going on. Our officers are trained to do it, and I'm confident that they would respond as they've been trained to do so.
Thank you.
Is the SRO budget, is that in the city or is that put in the school?
The school will
tab?
pay, the school will
They
pay for that
they pay
position.
okay.
Yes, since they're dedicated to the schools, they would be paying for that
And
position.
Unless I missed something, do we have that?
We do not. Currently, we do not. That, we're hoping to get that back in the near future.
Is that because the school district doesn't want to pay it?
So
or-
it's kind of a mess in the sense that, so when COVID happened, they canceled the SRO because they didn't have any kids in the schools, and they said, we don't need the SRO. At the exact same time, we had an officer that was retiring, so we were able to absorb that school resource officer back into us without it really impacting our budget because they were paying for that position. So we absorbed it, and we went for that full year without an SRO. Then they finally got back to having kids in school, and they were like, hey, can we get an SRO back? Well, that was right after all of 2021, and staffing has been very short. And so we haven't been able to dedicate an officer to them since that time.
So it's not federally funded?
No, no. And right now, it's literally a more of a body issue. We need to get our patrol staffing where we need to be, and then I've already had conversations with the superintendent. There's definitely an interest from the schools to get one back.
So when they were in the schools, how many SROs were there?
Just one.
Yeah, at Curtis High School?
Correct, but they service all the schools within the district, yeah. But I think they primarily are at the high school, but they'll respond and deal with all the schools. There was years ago back, so I used to be your sergeant here in 2009. We had 2 SROs in the mid-2000s. Jennifer might remember that. We had 2 back then, but we do operate with 1 currently, and I think 1 is certainly sufficient.
2 questions. So currently, if you said earlier something about that you have, not a day goes by that you don't either have someone in training or calling sick or something. So nobody backfills from Pierce County Sheriff to fill that slot during a shift, or you just do that with your existing staffing? How does that work? And then number 2, if you were to do the levy and go up to 26 staff, how many years do you anticipate that 26 staff will be enough?
Okay.
Have you thought about that?
Sure. So first question is, when we are down a person from that 2 and somebody goes on training or something, how do we fill that? So it's an overtime shift, and we try to fill it with, it's open to the officers that work in UP first. If they want to take on those additional hours, they'll sign up for it and work it. Then if they don't, it goes to the whole sheriff's department. So we can get a deputy that works at South Hill or Spanaway or one of the detachments. They'll come in and work that shift. What we're facing right now is the sheriff is in a staffing challenge as well, and they're having overtime, and so those officers are basically working that only, and they're not coming in to backfill for us. And so when we don't get a volunteer, we hold over an existing officer to either...
So you never go down to like just 1?
No, our minimum staffing is, that means we commit to that at all times, and that's on overtime or holding somebody over. We don't like to hold somebody over for the full shift. So let's say right now, let's say it's a graveyard overtime shift. And for us, that's midnight to 6 a.m. would be the overtime. That swing shift officer gets off at midnight. The day shift is coming on at 6. We make the swing shift stay for 3, and we tell the day shift to come in early for 3. We do not want to have that swing shift guy who's already worked 10 works 6 more hours into the wee hours. So it's becoming more frequent because we don't have that additional capacity. It's just the number of bodies that we have, they're all kind of getting worn out. And of course, it's summertime. I mean, we all want to take some vacation and spend time with our families. So we're having more and more challenges around that. And I think you had a second question for me.
How long will the 26?
The hiring. So we're going to hire 10 more to get to that 26. And like I said, staffing or hiring is getting better. And I would anticipate it's going to be a phased-in approach of probably 3 per year is what we need to expect. It's not going to be all 10 at one time. But I think it's reasonable under the projections now to think of it in that 3 per year, so probably 3 years, so maybe that 4th year we'll be finishing it off.
And then, so if you're at the 26, how many years will 26 be enough?
Well, thinking, I can't predict the future. I wish I could. I'd probably be a millionaire, right? But just looking at our statistics and where we're at, and if we get to that 26 number, just based on our calls for service, then if you remember that old chart that said we have 389 calls per officer, if we get to that 26, we're going to drop down to 239, which is below the average of everybody at 267. So it gives us, I think, a buffer of room moving forward. Certainly, if we wanted to go all the way back up to 389 per officer, I don't think we'll ever reach that again. But I foresee it well into the future, 10, 15 years easily. We've been operating for the last 13 years with 16 officers, so doing a good job, I like to think. But we could certainly, there's room for improvement to do better. And then I think, sir, you had it.
Good evening, Chief. Good evening, everybody. First of all, sorry about my Italian accent. Chief, regarding the slide with the number of people you need, is also considering the people they decide to leave the force or the people that retire? Because you need 2 people each shift, correct? So it's also calculated the people that go in retirement or also the people that decide to leave the force? It's all combined?
So, yeah, that's our operating number. So we'll have 26 assigned here. If somebody was to retire or leave, that's kind of the beauty of the contract. We're notifying the Sheriff's Department that this person is going to leave, and then we're preparing for that new position. So we are doing the selection process right away. So we will always operate with 26. If somebody is on long military leave, so they've been on activated maybe for a year, currently we have one that's out for 2 years, the Sheriff's Department typically backfills. When staffing is the normal, they would send somebody over to maintain our staffing levels at 26, even when that person has been activated on military. Currently, we're not able to do that. The sheriff is struggling with the staffing on their end as well, so they're trying to tell basically everybody throughout the department, work with what you've got as best you can. As our numbers increase, we'll then start to backfill those. I hope I answered your question.
Perfect. Thank you, Chief.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
Did I hear you correctly that if in fact we were at the 10 number, 10 or up 26, getting 10 new employees, that you'd be titrating 3 employees a year, so it's a total of 3 years before you're going to have the full complement?
Yes, that would be my projection at this point.
And then in terms of the money, are you bringing in enough money every year to pay for the full 26, yet you're delaying 6 of the people for 2 years? What happened if that's right, what happened to the other money? I don't think people are going to sit well with that. I think I read some of the emails that you folks get. Some people are supportive, some people aren't supportive, some people have a lot of capital letters screaming at you about no taxes in the emails you get. But to hear that we're paying full price from day one and we don't see the fruits of that for 3 years, I don't think that's going to sell.
Go ahead.
I assume the chief is going to try to get as many officers as possible, as soon as possible, right? So all the money, and we've talked about this in previous meetings, all the money that is collected from this tax goes into the public safety fund. How long that money lasts, we're not entirely sure. It's going to depend on a lot of factors. So if there is an excess amount of money collected in any given year, that money's still in the public safety fund, and it will support, the out years and delay when we have to come back again.
Do you have a rainy day component to this fund so that nobody can touch it? So what I see happening is you use some of those monies then to backfill the 40% that's being paid if you're stretched there because of inflation and other things.
So all of the property tax goes to the public safety fund.
Well, understand
there is no rainy day fund or any other kind of fund. It's all the public safety fund. And we're spending as we go. So there is no, separation and there's no diversion. It's all in that fund. And it's all going for whoever we managed to get during that time period.
Yeah, if I walk into we don't have voting booths anymore. If after I fill out my ballot and it passes, I'm expecting 10 new employees by the end of next year, and you're telling me I'm not gonna get them, how am I gonna respond as the average citizen when I said, okay, I heard you the need, and now you're not fulfilling that need?
I am fulfilling the need. It just takes time to get to that point. You know, I was hired almost 30 years ago by the sheriff under a levy that hired 50. We didn't hire 50 in one hiring session. It takes you time over the span of well, at that time they hired it over several years. So even under, we were never in a position where we were going to get 10 all at one time. And maybe that's an issue for some people, but I will say is our plan is that it might get better. We're going to ask for all 10, but I highly doubt the sheriff's going to say, absolutely, here you go. But also the money, we've already talked about what are we going to do. If we don't have traffic officers yet, we're going to have extra money to be able to do some traffic enforcement with other agency officers, bringing them in, more dedication to doing that to kind of fill that gap until we're able to get more officers in here. I think second.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I'm not a police officer, so I'm not going to be naive enough to assume that I know what it takes to get trained up. That seems kind of arrogant. But so how long does it actually take from the time that a police officer finishes the academy, which is my understanding is actually quite a bit of time just to get through the academy? What's the amount of time that they spend in the field getting up to speed so that they can be an independent law enforcement officer? So
under the contract, the sheriff requires a minimum of 10 months that we're paying for that officer to conduct the hiring process, they go through a month of training before they go to the academy. The academy is 720 some hours now, so it's 4.5, 5 months that they're in the academy. Then they come out of the academy and they're in field training with an experienced officer for an additional 16 weeks. So under the current system with the sheriff, like I said, it's 10 months before you can even get that first body. So again, I said earlier, January 1, sheriff, please give us however many. Okay, well, you're not going to see them until November because of that process. So almost a year for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, over there.
Do you know roughly how many bodies short Pierce County is right now?
I think he's at 52 is the last that I heard. Out of 300, they have 350, 55, and that includes us, though,
Right.
as a part of that.
Right, because I know Tacoma's running about 47 short.
Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah.
I was just curious.
The sheriff's department just passed, we just did a union contract, and the county did some hiring incentives. I think I just looked yesterday, I think we have 6 or 7 in the academy, another 10 that are in training right now, and 3 or 4 that are in pre-academy training. I don't know what's in the hopper in terms of hiring, but so we have some, we're also losing some to retirement and everything else.
So if positions open up, can present sheriffs request to come here, or does the sheriff tell them, say who can move? How does that work?
Yeah, so anytime we have a vacancy, it's opened up to everybody in the department, and those that are interested apply, and then we do a internal interview process. So they have to complete a packet like a resume. We review that, and then we have an interview that the city has a representative with myself and my sergeant here, and we conduct interviews and make a selection from that process.
What about officers from other cities, other parts of the state? Are they welcome to apply, or does it have to go through the Pierce County Sheriff's?
Through the Pierce County Sheriff's, yeah. Has to be a Sheriff's Department employee to work here in UP. Unless we did this like temporary thing where I'm talking about like traffic enforcement, we're just kind of talking through that idea of trying to create kind of that would be opened up to other agencies, because the city would be able to just pay them directly like in an off-duty capacity, but they would be here working officially doing whatever we ask them to do, whether it's traffic enforcement specifically or something like that. Is it really hot in here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. I was like, you guys are being nice, but man, I'm sweating. Okay, any final questions?
I got one for Eric, if
I'll
I
try.
remember what it was. Has the city given any thought in light of this 333 or any other issues with the contract of saying, contract go away, we're going to start our own police force?
I don't think that's a question for me. I think that's a question for the council. And we did actually do a study and Chief can speak to this better than I can. We did a study.
So we're getting a better deal from the county than you could with generating your own
Yes.
force?
Short answer is yes.
The short answer is yes. I think the biggest thing that people don't realize is, one, all the administrative issues, right? Me as your chief, I get to be your chief and deal directly with the community. I don't have to worry about all the administrative things that go along. Managing fleet, or we have an internal affairs division downtown that handles those complaint investigations, all of the computer stuff, my body cams and all that stuff. We have the sheriff's department resources that handle those things. And Councilmember Keel's jumping to my big punchline, liability being the biggest one. So if for some reason a deputy was, there was some sort of lawsuit that comes to the city is immune from that liability, it goes, the county covers all of that litigation and everything. So that's a big factor as far as contracting, one of the benefits. And of course, the access to all the resources of the sheriff's department as well. As I said, 350 some deputies, all the special units, the homicide investigations, the expertise that is within that department is available to us. Sometimes I gotta negotiate a little bit to get some of it out here, but it is certainly available, and it's one of the big benefits of the contract. All right, thank you. Last thing, any other questions that come up as you're thinking about it, don't hesitate to email or give me a call. I'll be happy to talk through anything. It should be on that flyer. There's information on how you can get hold of me. Thank you.
I do. Question then, this is for you, Rick. Any thought on this COO